Professor Richard Rothstein is a research associate at the Economic Policy Institute and senior fellow at Thurgood Marshall Institute of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. He is the widely acclaimed author of The Color of Law, in which he argues that segregation in America is a policy byproduct of government policies as well as private action. I'm very excited to be introducing him today, considering the impact he has had on my life in a very short time period. He's hearing this for the first time. I was introduced to his work 2 years ago while watching the video Segregated by Design, which brought together pieces of American history I had gathered over time but not fully connected. With my busy work schedule and small kids, it's very hard for me to sit down and read an academic book. However, I was fortunate enough last August to take a 2-week RV trip across 7 Western states and fully listen to The Color of Law on audiobooks. This gave me a chance to listen while looking across thousands of miles of the American landscape and thinking deeply about the policies and practices that shape the urban and rural fabric and who was allowed to live where and how that impacted the future prospects of both the white and minority communities. I was most surprised in this journey to learn about the diversity that existed in the Western and Midwestern rural towns where Black folks were forced to leave everything they had built up, and that community diversity was greater then than it is now. This obviously shaped our politics of this day. Remember, I was listening to this book during the election cycle as I passed by all these towns with flags on their lawn. To be honest, I came out of that experience very mad that I hadn't been taught this history, but also very empowered to spread the word and to seek change. It's impacted my life so much that right after the trip, I decided to pivot my practice as a real estate developer and start a new company grounded in addressing some of the issues that he will talk about today. We would like to thank him again for taking the time to be here and look forward to his keynote speech and questions and answers afterward. I pray and hope your life will be as transformed as mine has been by listening today. Please give him a virtual warm welcome. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you, Commissioner Oliva. I guess after that, I have to forgive you for listening to the book rather than reading the real book. I know how busy you are. Well, thank you for inviting me to give this presentation to you today. Let me begin by reminding all of us that in the 20th century, we had a civil rights movement in this country. It began by challenging segregation in colleges and universities. Then in 1954, won a Supreme Court decision that prohibited ongoing legal segregation in elementary and secondary schools. And that Brown decision gave impetus, stimulus, inspiration to a movement of activists, people engaged in marches and demonstrations and civil disobedience. People lost their lives in that civil rights movement. Others were severely injured. But by the end of the 1960s, the civil rights movement had pretty much persuaded the country of something it hadn't realized before. Not everybody, but pretty much persuaded them. And that is that racial segregation was wrong, that it was immoral, that it was harmful both to African Americans and to whites, that it was incompatible with our self-conception as a constitutional democracy. With that understanding, the civil rights movement succeeded in desegregating public accommodations and public transportation and employment in many cases. Excuse me. And then in 1968, in the wake of the assassination of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., we succeeded in passing a Fair Housing Act that prohibited ongoing discrimination in the sale and rental of housing. But then the civil rights movement ended, and it left untouched the biggest segregation of all, which is that every metropolitan area in this country is residentially segregated. I've lived in many of them. Every one that I've lived in had clearly defined areas that were all white or mostly white, clearly defined areas that were all Black or mostly Black. I mean, how could it be? If we came to a broad understanding that racial segregation was wrong, immoral, harmful to both Blacks and whites, incompatible with our self-conception as a constitutional democracy, how could it be we left untouched the biggest segregation of all? Partly it's because it's hard to undo segregation once you establish it. If we pass an ordinance prohibiting discrimination in Restaurants, you go to any restaurant you want. But if you pass a law prohibiting segregation in neighborhoods, the next day things wouldn't look much different. And so what we've done, all of us, and I mean all of us, liberals, conservatives, Northerners, Southerners, Democrats, Republicans, Easterners, Westerners, is we've adopted a national rationalization, an excuse we give ourselves for failing to redress this biggest segregation of all. And that excuse, that rationalization goes something like this. We tell ourselves that the segregation of colleges and universities or schools or buses or restaurants, that was all done by government. If the federal government was doing it, it was a violation of the Fifth Amendment, civil rights violation, something we have an obligation to redress. If state and local governments were doing it, it was a violation of the 14th Amendment, also a civil rights violation, something that we have an obligation to redress. But residential segregation, we tell ourselves, that's something entirely different. That wasn't done by government. That wasn't done by law, by regulation, by public policy. That all just happened naturally, happened by accident. We have residential segregation because, bigoted white homeowners refused to sell or rent to white homeowners, to African-American homeowners in white neighborhoods. Or maybe businesses in the private economy, banks, real estate agencies, developers, discriminated in how they carry out their purely private sector activities, not government actions. Or maybe it's because people just like to live with each other of the same race. That's why we're segregated. We choose to live in homogenous, racially homogenous neighborhoods. Or maybe we tell ourselves it's all because of income differences. African Americans, many of them have lower incomes than whites on average, and so can't afford to move to more expensive middle-class neighborhoods. All of these non-governmental, individual, maybe bigoted, but private sector activities, it's what's created residential segregation. And we tell ourselves what happened by accident can only unhappen by accident. What happened naturally can only unhappen naturally. Most of us don't think it's a good thing. We don't like living in an apartheid society, but we don't feel it's our obligation to do anything about it because it's not a civil rights violation. It's not a violation of the Constitution. Well, I spent much of my recent years, until I started writing this book, writing about education policy, not about housing. I was the education columnist at the New York Times for a while, and in the late 1990s and 2000s, I wrote a number of columns and articles attacking the dominant educational theory of the country. It went something like this at the time. Some of you may remember it. We acknowledged that there was an achievement gap between Black and white students. On average, Black students have lower achievement than white students in our schools around the country, public and private. But we told ourselves that the reason we had that achievement gap was because teachers have low expectations. They just don't try very hard. They're bigoted. And if we can force teachers to try harder, the achievement gap will disappear. And we took this view, enacted it into a federal law that was widely supported across the political spectrum. It was called the No Child Left Behind law. The law required that children be tested every year, and we were going to hold schools accountable, teachers accountable for their test scores. And the law predicted that if we did this, if we held schools accountable for children's test scores, the achievement gap would disappear within 7 years. It was, in my view, a ludicrous theory behind this law. Of course, it's now 20 years out, and the achievement gap has not only not disappeared, but it's about the same size as it was 20 years ago. It's not that there aren't some teachers, some schools who don't try very hard to teach low-income children. That's part of the explanation for the achievement gap, but it's a very small part. The most important reason why we have an achievement gap is because so many low-income African-American children come to school with serious social and economic disadvantages that make it impossible for them to take advantage of what good schools have to offer. So I remember writing one column about asthma. As you may know, African-American children in urban neighborhoods have asthma at 4 times the rate of middle-class children in suburban neighborhoods. 4 times the rate. It's an enormous difference. And they have asthma at such a higher rate because they live in more polluted neighborhoods, more trucks driving past their homes, more dilapidated buildings, more vermin in the environment. And if a child has asthma, that child is more likely than a child who doesn't. It's not true in every case. It's just a matter of likelihood. More likely to be up at night wheezing, come to school the next day somewhat sleepy. A child who's somewhat sleepy is not going to learn as well as a child who comes to school well rested. And if you have two groups of children who are equal in every respect, similar in every respect, the same racial composition, same social and economic background, same family structure, same economic circumstances, with only one difference. One group has a higher rate of asthma than the other. That group's going to have slightly lower achievement, simply by not being as well rested in school as the other group. It's not going to make a big difference. But then you begin to think of all of the other social and economic conditions that have a similar impact on student achievement, whether it's asthma, lead poisoning, which has a measurable impact on IQ, homelessness, economic insecurity. You add all of these up, and you've pretty much explained the achievement gap. You leave very little left to be explained by low teacher expectations. Well, I soon realized as I was writing about this and studying it that it's one thing if a child has asthma or lead poisoning or homelessness or economic insecurity. It's another thing if you have a school where every child has one or more of these challenges. How can such a school ever be expected to have the same kind of achievement as a school where children come well rested, well nourished, in good health from economically secure homes? You can't have that realistic expectation no matter how many laws you pass requiring it. Well, we call schools where we segregate children like that, well, we call them segregated schools, where we concentrate children with those kinds of disadvantages. And schools today are more segregated than they have been at any time in the last 45 years in this country. And the reason they're more segregated is because the neighborhoods in which they're located are segregated. So I began to think that maybe neighborhood segregation was a school problem. I was an education writer, and I began to look into it further, and that's what led to this book that the commissioner described. Well, I was thinking along these lines, and then in 2007, I read a Supreme Court decision that evaluated two school districts. One was Seattle, Washington. The other was Louisville, Kentucky. Both of those school districts had a very, very token, trivial school desegregation plan. They gave parents in the school, in the district, the choice of which school in the district their child would attend. But if the choice was going to exacerbate racial segregation, that choice wouldn't be honored in favor of the choice of a child who might minimize it. So if you had an all-white or mostly white school, and both a black and a white child applied for the last remaining place in that school, the black child would be given some preference. Very, very trivial program. You don't have one place left in the school very often and have to choose between a black and a white applicant. But the Supreme Court denounced this program, said you couldn't do such a thing. The controlling opinion was written by Chief Justice John Roberts. The justice explained that it's true, he said, the schools in Louisville and Seattle are segregated, but he said they're segregated because the neighborhoods in which they're located are segregated. And then he went on to explain that the neighborhoods in Louisville and Seattle are segregated. The term he used was de facto, just in fact, not in law. It happened because of private bigotry, because of businesses in the private economy, because people wanting to live with each other of the same race, because of income differences. And he said, if you have de facto segregation, something that wasn't created by government, government is prohibited under the Constitution from doing anything about it. Well, I read this decision and it caused me to remember something I had read about Louisville, Kentucky some years before. In Louisville, there was a suburb called Shively. It was an all-white suburb of single-family homes. One of those single-family homeowners had an African-American friend living in the center city of Louisville. The African-American friend was a decorated Navy veteran. He had a wife and a child. He wanted to buy a single-family home, but nobody would sell him one. So the African-American friend bought a home that his white friend had purchased for him in this suburb of Shively. And when that African-American family moved in, an angry white mob protected by the police surrounded the home. They threw rocks through the windows and the police made no effort to stop it. They dynamited and firebombed the home and the police made no effort to stop that. But when this riot was all over, the state of Kentucky arrested, tried, convicted, and jailed with a 15-year jail sentence the white homeowner for sedition. And I said to myself, this doesn't sound to me much like de facto segregation. If the police, the prosecutors, the courts, all agents of state and local government were engaged in a conspiracy to maintain the racial boundaries of Louisville. It caused me to look into it further, and I found out that this was not an isolated instance. There were hundreds and hundreds, I'm not exaggerating here, hundreds and hundreds of cases in cities all across the country, on the West Coast, in Portland and Seattle, in San Francisco and Los Angeles, in Denver and Kansas City and Chicago and Detroit and New York and Washington. Hundreds of cases of police protected, sometimes police organized and led mob violence to drive African Americans out of homes, which they had legitimately purchased or rented in previously all white neighborhoods. I describe a number of these, obviously not many of the hundreds in The Color of Law. Every one of them where the police were either engaged in protecting, organizing, or leading mob violence to drive African Americans out of their neighborhoods, out of white neighborhoods, was a civil rights violation, a violation of the 14th Amendment, something that every one of us as an American has an obligation to remedy, but we've never accepted that obligation. We've never undertaken anything to remedy that kind of exclusion by state-sponsored violence. And then I began to look into it further. And I found it wasn't just state-sponsored violence that had created the segregation that we know today, but there were many, many federal, state, and local policies designed to ensure on a racially explicit basis that African Americans and whites could not live near one another in any metropolitan area of this country. Every one of these racially explicit government policies was a violation of the Constitution, a civil rights violation, also policies that we as Americans have an obligation under our Constitution to fix, that an obligation we've never undertaken. Well, I don't have time to describe many of these policies to you today. Commissioner Holiva, who read the book, who listened to the book, could tell you about others that I don't have time to cover, but let me just go over a couple of them. Perhaps the most powerful one was a policy of the Federal Housing and Veterans Administrations in the post-World War II period to suburbanize the entire white population, white working class and middle class population, who were then living in urban areas, to suburbanize them into single family homes in all white suburbs and prohibit African Americans from doing the same. At the time, in the mid-20th century, we had many more downtown integrated neighborhoods than we have today. We'd be stunned if we could somehow be transported back to that period of American history to see the extent of downtown integration that we had, for the simple reason that we were a manufacturing economy. None of this internet stuff that you've got in Oregon. We made things in factories, and factories had to be located near deep-water ports and railroad terminals to get their parts and ship their final products. And if you had a factory district that was employing both black and white workers, they had to live close enough to their workplaces to walk to work. Most of them didn't have cars. So you had broadly integrated neighborhoods. On top of that, you had millions of returning World War II veterans coming home, needing housing. There was a housing shortage. And so the federal government decided it was going to move these war veterans, as well as the whites living in the urban areas, into single family homes in all white suburbs. And with this policy, the federal government created a white noose around every metropolitan area of this country of single family, all white communities. Perhaps the most famous of them is across the country in Levittown, New York, but they exist on the West Coast, in the Midwest, everywhere. Levittown was 17,000 homes. Still is an enormous development. The builder, William Levitt, could never have assembled the capital to buy the land, build 17,000 homes in one place. No bank would be crazy enough to lend him the money to do such an enormous undertaking. He had no buyers for the places yet. The banks thought that nobody would want to buy because we weren't a suburban country yet. They didn't think people would want to live in places like this. The only way that Levitt and builders on the West Coast and the Midwest and the West and the South could get the funds to build these suburban communities was by going to the Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administration, submitting their plans for the development, the construction materials they're going to use, the architectural design, the layout of the streets, and a commitment required by the FHA and VA never to sell a home to an African American. The FHA even required Levitt and many of these builders all across the country to place a clause in the deed of every home prohibiting resale to African Americans or rental to African Americans. This was a federally required segregation. It was not the action of rogue bureaucrats working for the FHA and VA. The Federal Housing Administration had a written manual distributed to appraisers all over the country whose job it was to evaluate the applications of builders to create suburban communities. The manual said you could not recommend for a federal bank guarantee the application of a developer who was going to sell to African Americans in a white community. The manual went so far as to say that you couldn't even recommend for a federal bank guarantee the application of a developer who was going to build an all-white project if it was going to be located near where African Americans were living. Because in the words of the manual, that would run the risk of infiltration by inharmonious racial groups, quote unquote. That's what the federal manual said. This notion of de facto segregation is utter nonsense. There is no basis in reality, in history, to it. With this policy, and by the way, I just mentioned that aspect of the manual in the color of law. The commissioner wouldn't know this because she only listened to the book, but I have a picture, which she missed, of a 6-foot-high, half-mile-long concrete wall that a developer of a subdivision, all-white subdivision, was required to construct in order to get an FHA bank guarantee loan, because that wall would separate his development from a nearby African American community. Well, this policy suburbanized the white working class population. The homes that it created in these suburban communities were inexpensive at the time. They cost about $8,000–9,000 a piece, about twice national median income. In today's dollars, that's about $100,000 in inflation-adjusted dollars. Any returning war veteran, any working class family, black or white, with a job in the post-war economy could afford to buy a home at that price, especially if they had a long-term FHA or VA guaranteed mortgage. Returning war veterans were required to make no down payment. Whites gobbled up these homes. The waiting lists were long. African Americans were prohibited from even applying for these homes. Well, those homes, as you know, no longer sell for $100,000. I don't think you can buy a suburban home in Portland for $100,000 today. You can't do it in Levittown. You can't do it in any of these communities anywhere across the country. They now sell for, depending on the region of the country, $300,000, $400,000, $500,000. In some places, Berkeley, where I live, $1 million or more. Those homes are now unaffordable to working class families of either race. But the white families who were subsidized by the federal government to buy these on a racial basis in the late 1940s, early 1950s, gained over the next couple of generations wealth from the appreciation of the value of their homes, from their growing equity. They used that wealth to send their children to college. They used it to take care of maybe temporary emergencies, maybe temporary unemployment or medical emergencies. They used it to subsidize their retirements, and they used it to bequeath wealth to their children and grandchildren, who then had down payments for their own homes. African Americans were prohibited by explicit federal racial policy from participating in this wealth generating program. As a result, while today African American incomes on average, are about 60%, 60% of white incomes. But there's a whole story behind that disparity. I don't have time to talk about it today. But you'd think that if there was a 60% income ratio, there'd be a 60% wealth ratio as well. People can save the same amount of money from the same incomes. But in reality, while African-American family incomes are 60% of white family incomes typically, African-American wealth is only 5% of white wealth. And that enormous disparity between a 60% income ratio and a 5% wealth ratio is entirely attributable to unconstitutional federal housing policy that was practiced in the mid-20th century, and that's never been remedied, and that we've never accepted the responsibility to remedy. All of us as American citizens have that responsibility. We've never accepted it. Well, that wealth gap determines much of the racial inequality that exists today, not only the exclusion from suburbs, but the concentration of African Americans in low-income neighborhoods from which they have no opportunity to move to because they don't have down payments from the wealth that they've inherited from their parents the way whites do. That concentration of African Americans in low-income neighborhoods and urban areas predicts the achievement gap that I described before for reasons I described. It predicts health disparities between African Americans and whites. African Americans have shorter life expectancy, greater rates of cardiovascular disease because they live in more polluted neighborhoods, less access to grocery stores selling fresh food. It predicts the mass incarceration of African Americans and the abuse of young men by the police in that community. I'm not suggesting that no police officer would ever abuse African American men if it weren't for segregation. But when you concentrate the most disadvantaged young men in single neighborhoods where they have no access to good jobs, to the transportation to get to those jobs, to schools that aren't overwhelmed by the social and economic disadvantages and problems of their children, when you have those kinds of concentrations, it's inevitable that the police are going to assume a different stance that they do in the rest of the community. They're going to assume the stance of an occupying force, a force whose job it is to control a restive, disadvantaged population. Police behave in much the same way that occupying forces behaved in colonial countries in the 20th century throughout the world, whether in India or the Congo or any place like that. It's inevitable when we have that kind of concentration. And the wealth gap and the segregation that it supports also has another very, very dangerous, frightening effect. And that is the very, very great political polarization that we have in this country today, that we're all so much aware of. It largely tracks racial lines. It's not entirely racial, but it largely tracks racial lines. How can we ever expect to develop the common national identity that we need to preserve this democracy if so many African Americans and whites live so far from each other that they have no ability to empathize with each other, no ability to understand each other's life experiences? How can we ever develop a common national identity under those circumstances? So the ongoing consequences of that one policy that I've just described, the suburbanization on a wealth-generating white-only basis, has enormous consequences even today. We passed the Fair Housing Act in 1968. It says, okay, African Americans, you now have the right to move to Levittown or any of these other suburban communities. But of course, they're unaffordable to working middle-class families. I'm not talking about poor people, working in middle-class families of either race today. So the Fair Housing Act is incapable of redressing this segregation that we've created. Well, let me, I think I have time. Maybe I'll describe quickly one other policy, federal policy that was followed in the 20th century, and that's public housing. Most of us think of public housing as a place where poor people live, but that's not how public housing began in this country. It began in the New Deal during the Depression, the Franklin Roosevelt administration. It was not for poor people. It was for families who had jobs, stable incomes, could pay the full cost of the housing in their rent. It wasn't subsidized. We had a 25% unemployment rate in the Depression, but public housing was for the 75%. who could afford housing, but for whom no housing was available because there was no construction to speak of going on during the Depression. The Public Works Administration built the first public housing in this country, and everywhere it built it, it segregated it, creating separate projects for whites, separate projects for African Americans, frequently segregating those downtown integrated neighborhoods that I talked about before for the first time. The great African American poet, novelist, playwright Langston Hughes describes in his autobiography how he grew up in an integrated downtown Cleveland neighborhood. He said his best friend in high school was Polish. He said he dated a Jewish girl in high school. He was an integrated high school in an integrated neighborhood. What do you expect to happen in such a situation? But the Public Works Administration went into that neighborhood of Cleveland, demolished housing, and built two separate projects, one for whites, one for African Americans, creating a pattern of segregation there that persists to this day. Over time, the families in the white projects left because they were subsidized by the federal government to move to those suburban communities that I talked about. Public housing became all Black as jobs disappeared from urban areas. The factories that used to be near deep water ports and railroad terminals moved away. The remaining residents of public housing, who are now overwhelmingly Black, lost those jobs, became poorer and poorer. Public housing had to be subsidized, and it became the concentration of low-income families that we came to know with contemporary late 20th century public housing. This was done all over the country. In my book, where possible, I like to describe self-satisfied, smug places. I don't know if maybe you're one of them, think you're better than the rest of the country. One of them I talk about is Cambridge, Massachusetts. I know it's far away, but maybe you've heard of it. The area between Harvard and MIT, the Central Square neighborhood, was a fully integrated neighborhood in the 1930s, about half white and half Black. The Public Works Administration and other federal agencies went into that Central Square neighborhood, built two separate projects, one for whites, one for African Americans, creating segregation where it hadn't previously existed, and with other segregated projects elsewhere in the Boston area, reinforced that segregation. Well, the policies to redress segregation are well known. There is no mystery whatsoever about what we need to do. Policy experts, think tanks, journalists like me, spin out ideas about what we can do to redress segregation all the time. What's missing is not policy ideas. What's missing is a new civil rights movement, like the one I described earlier in this presentation. A new civil rights movement that's going to raise the temperature on this constitutional violation, on this offense to our status as a democratic society, and create the public pressure to enact some of these well-known policies. Some of them are more radical than others, but they're all necessary. One, I think, that is absolutely necessary is an affirmative action program in housing, whereby the federal government perhaps buys up homes at market rates, $300,000, $400,000, $500,000, in these suburban communities that were unconstitutionally created as white-only places, and resells them at deeply discounted rates to African Americans, whose forebears would have been able to move into those communities when they were affordable, but who now are no longer able to do so. At the low end of the income scale, we have programs that reinforce segregation today for African American and other low-income families. The low-income housing tax credit is the biggest of the federal programs to subsidize housing for low-income families. It's a tax credit that's distributed by the Treasury Department through states to nonprofit developers to build housing for low-income families. That low-income housing tax credit, the rules of the Treasury Department place a priority on placing low-income housing tax credit units in already low-income neighborhoods, reinforcing their segregation. I'm not suggesting we shouldn't put better housing in those neighborhoods. Of course we should. We should put better housing everywhere. But to place a priority in placing low-income housing tax credit units in places where it will reinforce segregation, that's backwards. We should be placing more of those units in higher opportunity places where families have the opportunity to access good jobs and transportation and grocery stores that sell fresh food and clean air, and schools that aren't overwhelmed by the social and economic problems of all of their children. One of the things reasons we can't place more of those units in high opportunity places is because once those communities were created as segregated all white neighborhoods, they adopted zoning ordinances that prohibit the future construction of townhouses and garden apartments and duplexes and triplexes. I know that Oregon has prohibited now those kinds of ordinances in cities, but I don't believe that those ordinances cover suburbs, which are the biggest offender in the maintenance of segregation today. The other program that the federal government maintains to subsidize low-income housing is the Section 8 voucher program that provides not a subsidy to builders, but to families who can't afford market rents in their community. The Section 8 voucher amount is calculated based on what's needed to afford the median rent in a metropolitan area. But I'm sure you can all understand that the median rent in a metropolitan area is too low to afford a rental in a high opportunity community. It's actually too high than is needed, higher than is needed to afford rent in a low-income segregated neighborhood. And landlords in those neighborhoods typically charge more than the market would require and exploit the program as a result. There are a few cities in this country that are experimenting by adjusting their Section 8 vouchers to provide higher amounts for families who want to rent apartments in higher opportunity communities if they happen to be available, if those zoning ordinances don't prohibit them, and reduce the amounts in low-income segregated neighborhoods where they're too high than is necessary. But there are very few. That should be done everywhere. That should be a universal requirement. The Section 8 voucher program, of course, also is not an entitlement, and only 1/4 of the families who are eligible for the vouchers receive them because the appropriations aren't large enough. There are many, many other policies that we follow in order to reinforce segregation. Many of them are race neutral on their face, like the zoning ordinances that I described, but in fact, they perpetuate segregation. I'm writing a new book now, a sequel to The Color of Law, that you might even be able to read it, not listen to it. You'll forgive me. I give up on that now. It's an explanation of what local civil rights groups could do to redress segregation in their communities. And along with that, I'm working with a group of national civil rights leaders and fair housing leaders to create something we call a new movement to redress racial segregation that will have a staff of organizers who will assist groups in forming those local civil rights committees so they can take action to redress segregation in their own communities. Among the things that can be done is action in the private sector that will not happen voluntarily, but which a local civil rights group could take action to make more likely. One of the columns I wrote recently that came out of the work for the new book describes a community in California, a suburban community, all white, created as all white, with restrictive covenants on every home in the mid-20th century. That's now unaffordable to working class families of either race. And in this article, and I can make this available to you if you want, I'll send you some links afterwards, and you can distribute it to attendees if you'd like. In that article, I describe how you can identify, and I do identify, the bank, the real estate agency, the developer that in collaboration with the federal government created that community as a segregated white neighborhood that's still all white today. That bank, that real estate agency, that developer have an obligation to be part of the solution, not just part of the problem. And a local civil rights group could press them to create, you might call it a voluntary reparations fund, to subsidize the movement of African Americans into the community from which that bank, that real estate agency, that developer excluded them in the mid-20th century. As I say, there are many, many policies we should follow. The real estate agency, the real estate industry needs reform. There's still a great deal of steering that goes on. Not every real estate agent, not perhaps most of them, but enough so that African Americans who can afford housing are steered away from white neighborhoods and towards places where the real estate agents tell them they'll be more comfortable. That is in predominantly Black or very diverse neighborhoods. That is a reform that's necessary, and all the entire real estate industry is licensed by state government. And if state government were more aggressive in monitoring this kind of steering, and they can do it with audit studies in which matched pairs of potential buyers are sent to agents to try to buy a home and document the steering that takes place. If we were more aggressive in enforcing the Fair Housing Act, that could be a step in the right direction as well. Well, I think I've used up the generous time you've given me, and I'd be glad to answer any questions or engage in discussion that you might have. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor.
Oh, I'm no
me
professor.
a bunch of times.
Well, I didn't mean to pick on you.
The book. I bought the book,
good.
so I can go and look at the pictures now.
Okay.
I had good intentions when I started. How about that? Well, thank you. I'm going to ask some questions from the audience, but I had a couple of things to start off with. It's funny because every time I wrote down a question, you would answer it right after. So one of the things I wrote down is you should write a sequel to the book, partly because when I listened to the book, I got really interested in, okay, now what are the solutions that we can do either as, I'm a developer by day, and then my volunteer time is as a commissioner. And I was very eager to kind of consume that. And I listened to the appendix and the prelude, I was trying to find more answers. And you really laid out in the book the role of the federal government, the role of the state government, the role of the school, every actor. And I had actually expected developers to be more of the bad guys in the story, which I was surprised that they weren't as much, partly because I felt like the federal government really influenced what they did, right? Kind of directed them to do that. So I guess I'm just putting a push for, it'd be really great. I think there's people in Oregon at all these different sectors who have now learned from your book and are eager to participate in some way. And I feel like it doesn't have to just come from activists, right? It can come from the development sector. It can come from policy. So I just wanted to ask a general question. You said this before, kind of, that we need a new civil rights movement. In a way, I felt like Black Lives Matter is a new civil rights movement. And I guess the question is, what would need to happen in this new civil rights movement to actually address housing discrimination, housing segregation, and who would be the main actors of this civil rights movement?
Well, the Black Lives Matter movement is a phenomenal development in my view. We're having a more accurate and passionate discussion about race and racial inequality and the legacies of slavery and Jim Crow in this country than we ever have had before in American history. It's not just the Black Lives Matter movement. It's not just the stunning reception to my book. If you look at the bestseller list, you'll see that many, many books deal with this history. We have white elected politicians in the South running around taking down statues that commemorate the defenders of slavery. So we have, I'm very encouraged that the potential for a civil rights movement exists. But the Black Lives Matter movement demonstrations is not such a movement. Out of that movement has to come local activist groups who are going to take action in their local communities to press for these kinds of changes. The civil rights, the Black Lives Matter movement put forward demands for more police accountability, for community policing, for the demilitarization of the police, but it was not typically organized into local committees that were pressing for reform of housing policy. So that's a next step that needs to be taken, and that's what this new movement to redress racial segregation proposes to do. We're going to send organizers to different communities and bring people together who are interested in taking action and develop plans to take such action. And as I say, if you have if you want to send out an email to attendees, I can give you a way to
Yes, that'd be great.
find out more about this. So that's what I think is necessary. And let me say one other thing. I know you're a developer, and I probably shouldn't say this because I've made fun of you for listening to a book, and now I'm going to pick on you for something else. But
No, that's fine.
I don't mean to by focusing on the unconstitutional actions of the government. I don't mean to let developers off the hook. They were willing collaborators in this policy of segregation. But the reason that I call this an unconstitutional system, and this is a very important point, is that but for the requirements of the federal government and state and local governments, no matter how discriminatory developers wanted to be, they would not have been able to discriminate but for the requirement of the federal government. So for example, the example I used earlier, and it's I'll just follow through with it because it's an example that I've already begun with, Levittown. William Levitt was a bigot. He would not have sold to an African American if given the choice. But he wasn't given a choice. If he had been told by the federal government, yes, we'll guarantee your bank loans if you sell homes in Levittown on a non-discriminatory basis, he would have had to do so, bigoted or not. So that's why I say that that it's an unconstitutional system. It's not that the private sector wasn't willingly involved, but the private sector can't tell the government what to do. The government can tell the private sector what to do, and it did. And they were willing participants in this unconstitutional framework.
Understand. And so talking about the role of government, I'm going to start with a little bit about Oregon and then ask one of the questions from the audience. You were talking, I heard you talk at Stanford University's Leadership for Society, Race and Power conversation. And obviously I was an attendee on that. And one of the first things you said as a solution is to get rid of exclusionary single family zoning. And in a way, like, as if nobody had done it before. And I was like, Oregon, you know, but obviously I couldn't say that. So now that that's happened in Oregon, I want to take this question from Amy Donahue, which says, where have you seen zoning or other ordinances push back successfully on previous racist policies, making real physical and societal change?
Well, I do think, and I think I said that Oregon has done this for cities, I think over 10,000 population is what your statute says. Minneapolis did it throughout the city of Minneapolis, but it didn't go beyond that. And I think that abolishing single family zoning is an essential step towards desegregation, but it itself is not going to accomplish it, especially in places like Portland, where there's a hot housing market. If you create the opportunity for townhouses and garden apartments and duplexes and triplexes, what can you go to quadruplexes in Portland?
Cottage clusters.
Yeah, cottage clusters. If you do that in a place like that, it's a necessary first step, but there's no assurance or even likelihood that it will accomplish significant desegregation, because in the hot market of Portland, those units will be gobbled up by professionals, whites who now can't afford to live as close to where they work as they would like, who can't live in the communities where they grew up, and without additional actions, and subsidies in particular, for African Americans who are excluded from of those communities by a combination of zoning ordinances and lack of wealth, lack of savings from the unconstitutional policies of the government. Both of those need to be done. So I think that zoning reform is an essential first step. But
and related to that, to the subsidies, to the concept of wealth creation, at least from my experience in Oregon and probably all over the United States, there's really been a shift in thinking about affordable affordable homes, more from the Levittown of home ownership to rental, subsidies and rental housing. And Levittown was at a certain scale, right, that you don't really see now. I guess, what are your thoughts on how the federal government and or state government can promote development at scale, development, home ownership development that was, is the engine for this wealth creation that was seen in the past, but obviously for marginalized communities?
Well, let me say, gets a little bit complicated. I am all in favor of increasing African American home ownership and other disadvantaged communities as well. There are many advantages to owning a home, and it doesn't have to be a McMansion on a large lot. It can be a townhouse or a garden, home, a condominium. I'm all in favor of increasing home ownership. All homeowners are more invested in their communities. They're more involved in community affairs. They take more pride in their neighborhood. They're more involved in their children's schools. So there are lots of good reasons to increase home ownership. African American home ownership now today is at about 45%, whereas for whites it's about 72% nationwide. So that's an enormous gap. But although the wealth gap was created by differences in home ownership, it's not necessarily the case that home ownership today is going to significantly address the wealth gap. It has other advantages that I just mentioned. But there are two ways that you gain wealth from owning a home. One is if you stay in a home for a long period of time with an amortized mortgage, it becomes a forced savings program. And over time, your monthly payments have more and more portion of it principal and less interest, and that principal is savings, and you're gaining wealth from that forced savings program. But the way that the wealth gap was created was not primarily with forced savings through an amortized mortgage. It was because white neighborhoods appreciated in value. This was a windfall. This wasn't from savings. This was a windfall. And historically, African American homeowners have gained less wealth from home ownership than whites have, because white neighborhoods have appreciated in value more than Black neighborhoods have. So simply increasing Black home ownership is not in itself going to give that extra wealth gain that comes above the forced savings of an amortized mortgage from the inflation in the land values and where the homes are located. In order to gain wealth from home ownership in that second way, it's speculation. And like all speculation, it's a gamble. You've got to buy a home in a neighborhood that's going to appreciate faster than other people think it's going to appreciate. If everybody knew it was going to appreciate, you wouldn't have the opportunity to buy a home there. Speculators would buy them, as in fact is happening a lot in the West Coast with foreign speculators buying up properties because they expect them to appreciate in value. So unless you're smart enough and smarter than everybody else to be able to know where a neighborhood's going to appreciate in value where nobody else realizes it, that's not a formula necessarily for gaining wealth. You may, by accident, because you're lucky, gain wealth in that way. But income policies are as important, if not more important, for generating wealth as home ownership policies are. And again, I'm not opposed to increasing home ownership. I think it's very important for the reasons I talked about before. But increasing the minimum wage, for example, as we're attempting to do nationwide, is a wealth generating program. People will be able to save some money. Doing a better job with our healthcare system so that people aren't broke when they have health emergencies. That's a wealth generating program. Improving Social Security so that people don't have to save for their retirement and use what little savings they have for their retirement. It's another wealth generating program. So I think there's excessive enthusiasm today for home ownership as some kind of miracle way to close the wealth gap. It's an important thing to do, but it's not a miracle way to close the wealth gap. You can be lucky and do it, but it's not a guarantee.
Yeah, and that makes sense. You can't buy a home if you don't have the wage to do. So they're
That's
interlinked.
true also.
So,
Although, let me say that many
yeah,
communities do have down payment assistance
right.
programs
That's true.
of small ones, and not
Yeah.
enough, and it should be more commonplace.
There's a lot of questions rolling in. I have to ask a legal one since this is a law conference. To your knowledge, has any member of the U.S. Supreme Court responded to your book/work, and has your book been cited in any federal opinions? And I guess I'll just add to that the role of your book in changing education knowledge in law. I mean, in my mind, a lot of times lawyers are the superheroes because they change the things that all the policy can come from. So you talked a lot about legal cases, and maybe you can respond to this.
Well, I really don't care what the Supreme Court says, because we're going to have a different Supreme Court by the time we get enough political movement from a new civil rights movement to make these policies possible. It's not going to start with the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court's going to be the last ones to recognize this. I will say, as you may know, you're a lawyer.
Oh, me?
The
No,
Supreme
I'm not a
No,
lawyer.
because okay.
I did take a land use law course, though.
Well, the audience, the participants are
Yes,
law
many
students.
lawyers.
The 2015 disparate impact case of the Supreme Court, in which it found that the disparate placement of low-income housing tax credit units was could be a violation of the Fair Housing Act by reinforcing segregation. The controlling opinion was written by Justice Anthony Kennedy, and he did cite the research that went into this book as a basis for that finding. So it had that amount of influence, but of course that all it said was that it could have a disparate impact. It didn't say that it did, and that decision has not had any significant effect on the replacement of low-income housing tax credit units. There are some communities that are doing a better job than others of placing more of those developments in higher opportunity places, but not nearly enough.
And then this is a good question, especially for Oregon. How can white people trained in planning and/or planning law support local activism to undo de jure segregation? How can we be good allies in Oregon?
Well, I give a lot of these talks about the history of segregation. And I always say, so I'll say it here, I am talking to you as citizens, not as planners, not as developers, not as lawyers. Every one of us has a role as a citizen. And I hope that all of you will be participants or supporters in one way or another of civil rights groups that are organized in your community and in your role as citizens of that community. Because unless the political environment changes, in which the kinds of policies that are needed to redress segregation become possible, all the great ideas that you may have as planners, as developers, to redress segregation will not be possible. They will be rebuffed by political resistance to accomplishing those things.
So there's a question related to that. It said the NIMBY attitude is such a barrier to making meaningful change with segregated housing. Shaming people out of their NIMBY mindset doesn't seem to work. What's the best way to help people realize that their mindset is so harmful to so many people, including creating integrated neighborhoods?
Well, you can tell by looking at me that I'm an old man. And I can remember things when I was young that have changed in the area of race in this country that have changed so radically that could never have been anticipated at the time that I was when I was young. So I can't tell you the path by which those attitudes will change, but I will say that without a new civil rights movement that's going to raise the temperature of this issue, they won't change. The country as a whole accepted segregation of public facilities prior to the 1960s. I'm not just talking about the South. Throughout the country, it accepted it. And somehow that changed because we had a civil rights movement that forced it to change. So I can't predict the route, but I do think that your role as citizens at this point is actually more important than your role as planners.
It's amazing. We might be up at our time. I thought maybe somebody would come on board and tell me. If not, should I keep going? Mark, maybe?
I think we're at time. Thank
Okay, so then I'll ask just one last question because everybody wants to know now. When is your new book coming out?
Oh, well, I just referred to the fact that I'm an old man. I'm old enough that I don't have to be accountable to anybody.
Nice.
So when it's done, it'll be done, and you'll hear about it.
Wonderful. Hopefully we can get little bits as we go along. I think everyone is super, now is a very critical moment, right? A change in federal government, a lot of exciting things happening in Oregon. What I see at the local level is people in all of these related professions to the book that you talked about, you know, banking and development and architecture and engineering, all eager to do something. And wanting to know that the thing that they're doing actually is the right thing. So I think the more you can give us, I think the better it'll be. Thank you.
Well, I will be spinning out articles from the work, and I will send you links to a couple of them so far.
Thank you. We'll get those passed out to the attendees. It's great meeting you. You've been a big influence in many people's lives. I don't think you know, or maybe you do. And my hope is that you can spread your message more and in more states and more jurisdictions. So please keep doing what you're doing. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.